Hello, AP Gov, and it's time to go over the remaining linkage institutions in government. We've already gone over the political party. We remember back in Unit 1, the political party basically is a group of people who come together to try to dominate government. They do so by running candidates and developing a party platform. And basically, their job is to try to dominate branches of government. That is their sole purpose. They are trying to dominate the legislative and executive branches by running candidates. The two that we're going to go over right now, the remaining two, are the media and interest groups. Remember, linkage institutions are institutions in our government that connect the people to the government. And so the media does that by basically fulfilling four roles. Role number one is that of the informer. It's kind of like their basic job description. The media reports on what the government is doing or not doing. It reports on who the major players are and what they are doing or not doing, and basically gives us a day-to-day snapshot of the activities of government. And so it is literally the most basic role of the media. It's what they've been doing since we've developed media. Um, Now the media has changed over time. It has become a little bit more partisan. People are looking for informers with a slant. So conservatives will check out Fox News more. Liberals might search out MSNBC. And so people are getting their information with a little bit more slant to it. But there are still also a good number of, uh, of neutral news organizations. And at the end of this, I'm going to show you a chart that will sort of highlight where the major news outlets are and where they would sit on a political spectrum. So role number one is the informer. Role number two is the watchdog. And they have always done this as well. They've always looked out for scandal and corruption, try to expose bad actors and bad players in the government, and more importantly, if there are any cover-ups to that. Um, the most famous example of this in modern history would be Watergate. Two reporters from the Washington Post, Woodward and Bernstein, um, basically exposed the Nixon administration and its break-in of the Democratic National Party in an office building named the Watergate, and that's how it got how the scandal got the name Watergate. Um, and basically, it eventually ended up bringing down the Nixon administration and President Nixon, who had before they exposed this. Basically, it said he had known nothing, and basically through their investigation, they found out that he knew everything. So they were able to expose his lying and, more importantly, his cover-up to try to hide the fact that he knew it, and that's ultimately what brought Nixon down. Some people complain that the media is more involved now and more concentrated on looking for scandals than doing number one, just reporting what's going on. And so that can be a negative of some of the media, depending on your, again, point of view of things. But role number two is the watchdog. Role number three is scorekeeper, and we're seeing this play out a lot right now with Biden and Trump. The media is constantly reporting on who's up in the polls, who's down in the polls, and they're trying to do an informal electoral count uh, for the presidential race. What they're not doing is they're not focusing on issues and explaining the difference between Trump and Biden. They're just constantly doing who's up and who's down, sort of a poll-driven look at the news. That's why it's called horse race journalism, because they're focusing more on who's winning. If you've ever been to a horse race, you know that the announcer is just constantly calling who's in first, who's in second, who's losing, who's moving up, who's moving down. And that's sort of a myopic or short-sighted way of looking at journalism. And so scorekeeping is sort of seen as a negative role of the media because it's just a very short-sighted look at politics and not a real deep, involved look at the issues and how the real differences between the candidates. Number four is the gatekeeper. The media has a lot of power in what stories it decides to run and which stories it decides not to run. And that decision of what to run and what not to run is known as agenda setting. They set the agenda by deciding what to cover and what not to cover. So right now there's a lot of stuff on the presidential race and there's a lot of stuff on COVID. Because of that, then you have the green statement that the media does not tell us how to think, but it does tell us what issues to focus on. So because the media is focusing on the election and is focusing on COVID, that's what America is sort of fixated on. If the media were to present and highlight and push another story, then that might get more traction with the American people. Now, does the media control the people or do the people control the media? That's kind of a chicken and egg question, but certainly they do set the agenda by what they cover and not cover. Um, and another thing about they don't tell us how to think. A liberal person could watch Fox News for a month and they still would not be conservative. A conservative could watch MSNBC for a month and then all of a sudden is going to become a big tree hugging liberal. That's what we mean by the media doesn't tell us what to think. We pretty much think for ourselves. But again, what the media does do is it sets the agenda and tells us what to think about by basically presenting certain stories and not presenting certain stories. Sort of along with that, narrow casting, and this could go up to number one with the information. Um, Narrow casting is basically the dissemination of information to a narrow audience. And so one of the detractions is that more people are getting their information from very slanted viewpoints. This is known as narrowcasting. Whereas, 50 years ago, there was a lot less news outlets because of the internet, because of cable, um, and they were, for the most part, relatively neutral. People will always complain about a liberal bias, but for the most part, they were pretty straightforward. Now, you did still have some liberal and conservative outlets out there that had that reputation, but there were so few of outlets out there that you kind of didn't have a choice. Whereas now, because of the democratization, if you will, of the media, we have very conservative media outlets like Breitbart and Fox News and the Drudge Report, and then we have a lot of liberal ones, MSNBC, the Young Turks, Huffington Post. So narrowcasting is basically just providing information toward a narrow audience or basically with a slant or bias, one way or the other. Another downside to the current media situation is that the media is often owned by corporations, and corporations only have one intent and one purpose in life, and that is to make money. And so because they own the news, they see the news as a money-making venture, not as an informative outlet. And so they have forced news outlets to become more entertaining to draw a bigger crowd where they can make money off of advertising. And this has become the edutainment factor of news, the informing versus profit making, the informing versus being entertaining. That is information providing becoming more entertaining because you need ratings. And so you have things like people yelling at each other all the time. You have more combative journalism, or what they call adversarial journalism. And all of this is potentially because corporations are wanting their news organizations to make money and to draw bigger crowds so that they can advertise and get advertising money. And so it's all a vicious circle, if you will. So that is our brief look at the media. I want to show you next sort of a political spectrum of the media outlets. Alrighty, so as promised, here is a look at a bunch of media outlets and where they might rank on a political spectrum chart, or a bias chart more realistically. I have to admit this is not mine. I got this from the AP Gov Facebook group, but I do like it a lot because it sort of um, layers things as far as quality all the way down to not quality. And I'm going to tell you a couple of things where I would move things as well. But basically, your quality ones are in sort of the green box area. Um, and again, you might say that some of these are a little bit more biased or skews more liberal versus, straight down the middle, or that they might fit more on the skews conservative. The Wall Street Journal probably would skew conservative. NPR would probably skew liberal. But you've got your major uh, news outlets from the big three channels. Then you've got PBS. Again, some people might say that they might skew a little liberal, but these are your pretty straightforward uh, news organizations where they're going to pretty much present. Probably, I would say that the best reputation of being right down the middle would be the AP and Reuters. They are seen as sort of the most neutral of them all. Then you've got famous leaning liberal again, New York Times, Washington Post. Again, the Wall Street Journal would lean to the right a little bit. National Review, which was started by William Buckley, a very famous conservative, is up there as well. You've got The Economist, which takes a look more obviously at the economic look. Then you get into sort of the second tier, where again pretty fair, but again a little bit more slanted. So you've got the Atlantic, you've got the Daily Beast over there, you've got the Weekly Standard on the conservative side, the Washington Times. I would say the New York Post might be somewhere over here as well. Um, MSNBC and CNN definitely, I guess, on the liberal side of things. Um, and then you get more into the lesser quality ones. Down here in the orange, unfair, very slanted on things. So, for instance, Huffington Post definitely going to take a very progressive look at things. OAN and the Drudge Report definitely are on the very conservative side, pro-Trump. At least OAN very much pro-Trump. Drudge has really gone after Trump lately. They've got the New York Post actually down here, so I thought it might be up here, but they've got it pretty much down here. And then in your red box, a lot of what people consider damaging things like the Inquirer, InfoWars, which is basically just straight conservative conspiracy theories. The conservatives might put Breitbart up a little bit higher, and they might move Huffington Post down a little bit more. Then you've got a bunch of liberal ones that are, again, in there as well. The Young Turks, I know, is a liberal one that would probably go somewhere in these two areas right here. So I'm going to post this on the Classroom, Google Classroom, again, for you to take a look at it. Shoot me any thoughts that you have on this. Again, this is not mine, but it is a way to look at the conservative, or to look at just media outlets in general. And the thing that I remember when I first saw this is just how many, both on the liberal and conservative side, how many news outlets I didn't know about or even hear about before. So this really opened up my mind to just seeing just how many outlets there are out there. So hopefully that'll do the same for you, and you'll be able to be a better consumer of information. So that's it for the media. And now we're going to move on to interest groups. All right, so now we move on to interest groups, and One of the questions that I do know that AP likes to ask is a comparison. What's the difference between an interest group and a political party? Remember, an interest group is just a group of people who come together for a common interest or cause, and they basically all they care about is getting that policy passed. They want to see their interest passed into law, whereas a political party cares about dominating government. Interest groups don't care about dominating government, they just want to see their policy passed. So they are policy experts, interest groups, on the policy that they are trying to push. You may not like the way that they're trying to push that policy, but you cannot deny that they are policy experts. So, for instance, the NRA, there is no doubt that they know a lot about guns. You may not like their position on guns, but they are gun experts. So, interest groups, think of them as what Madison called for in Federalist 10, that the more interest groups you have, the better off you are because they're all going to compete and check each other and things are going to remain fair. So that's the biggest thing that interest groups do. Now, interest groups are going to try to access or influence the government, and we know that they're going to try to influence all three branches, and there are different ways that they can do that. We've already talked a little bit about the iron triangle, which sort of fits into interest groups because they are one of the three main parts of the iron triangle. But when we talk about interest groups trying to influence the government, we're talking about the three L's. And one of them doesn't start with an L, but it has L in the first couple letters, and so I'm just going to go with the three L's. L number one is and the thing that they do the most is they try to lobby the government. So by lobbying, we're talking about influencing government policy, and they do that primarily by meeting with officials or calling them or emailing them. They will meet and socialize with them. If you are an interest group that is trusted by that politician, then they will actually let you even draft legislation that they will later turn in. Interest groups often testify at committee hearings in order to push Congress one way or the other. They are constantly providing political information for members of Congress and members of the executive branch to push out to help defend their positions and policies. So these are the main ways that interest groups lobby. Now, some people would say that when they try to meet and socialize and take politicians out to lunch and dinner, that starts to cross the line between lobbying and bribery. A politician will say, "I'm never bribed by a dinner or by baseball tickets or football tickets. I'm already either supporting them or I always keep a professional distance between that." But the number one thing that interest groups will do is lobby the government. And the biggest thing that they do is testify and provide information because remember, they are policy experts. Number two, and this is the one that doesn't have the L, but it's the second letter, electioneering. And so electioneering is basically helping politicians get elected by volunteering and helping them push their candidacy. Remember, interest groups don't run candidates, but they will support candidates. And one way that they can support candidates is by electioneering. They will get on the phone and call their members or call people in public and say how they support that candidate and why. They will often attend rallies where they will be in large numbers to show their support for the candidate. They will help get out the vote when it's time to get out the vote. So interest groups will help politicians get elected by helping them run their campaigns and getting the mass numbers out. And then the third way is by using the judicial branch, and that is through litigation. So interest groups will either start a lawsuit in order to challenge or push a policy through the courts, or they will file amicus briefs in order to influence the Supreme Court in its decision-making process. Both of those activities, though, utilize the judicial branch only for that activity. So litigation just means starting a lawsuit. And so think of Brown versus Board of Education. The NAACP, basically provided free lawyers to Linda Brown because they wanted to take that case to court. Environmental groups all the time will sue to get something stopped as far as pollution goes. Right now, you're seeing a lot of interest groups sue to stop mail-in balloting or to allow for mail-in balloting. The ACLU does this a lot. So interest groups will use the courts to try to get their way as well. And then interest groups basically can be broken down into one of four groups. Interest groups either have an economic interest, and so they represent labor, they represent farmers, or they represent business. Those are the big economic interests, and there are many interest groups that would fall into this category. Then you've got your environmental interests. Think Greenpeace, think the Sierra Club. They're out basically trying to push, especially for climate change legislation. You have equality and civil rights groups, and the LGBTQ would fall into this. The NAACP would fall into this. And then you also have consumer and public interests as well. These would be things like, again, the ACLU, which just looks out for the First Amendment. You've got the Federalist Society, which looks to push more conservative ideals for legislation and lawyering, if you will. So those are basically the four types of interest groups, and interest groups can fall into one of those four categories, and then interest groups utilize one of three major activities to try to influence the government: lobbying, electioneering, and litigation. So that is our look at the interest groups and the media. We are done taking a look at the linkage institutions. Remember, they are interest groups, the media, and political parties. They all try to connect the people with their government. Hope this helped. See you later.